Good morning. This is Floyd Abrams of Speaking Freely. We're so very glad today to have Kara Swisher with us. She is, as I'm sure you will all know, an opinion writer for the New York Times, a contributing editor of New York, the host of the podcast Sway, co-host of the podcast Pivot, and she's just told me that she took a course I taught at Columbia more than a few years ago.
More than a few years.
So welcome, and thank you so much for coming here.
Thank you. I just want to say it was one of the best. It was my only law course in my life, and it was the best one I ever took, and it was wonderful. It helped me stay out of trouble over these many years.
No libel suits ever?
No, not yet, not yet. But that doesn't mean it. It's a long life.
Well, look, why don't we start with, I think, the unavoidable horror story of this week, and of more than that, the horrific murders in Texas of so many children and the like. And I'll just start out with a broad question. I mean, do you have any hope that as a country we're going to find some way to deal with issues like this?
Well, it's interesting because I've been dealing with this kind of stuff a lot through the lens of tech, obviously. And there's a couple of tech elements here. Obviously, misinformation and disinformation. And a lot of it plagues not just elections or COVID, but also gun reform. The ideas of a lot of this stuff moving through the system where everybody gets their information around, what actually is being proposed, and sort of the twisting of what the Second Amendment means, and the First Amendment, by the way. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about the impact of that. In this case, and also a lot of these people who do these shootings tend to avail themselves of big tech platforms to broadcast. It's been a new phenomena. Whether they post their diatribes or they actually film their crimes, which is horrific, but that this is what has happened, and then they proliferate and then inspire others. That's what happened in Buffalo last week. The murderer was inspired by the New Zealand murderer, and used similar tactics in terms of tech. This particular one was not the same, and one of the things that was interesting was that the governor of Texas tried to blame social media. In this case, not at all. This person did not use social media except as a normal teenager might, and he did communicate with people right before, but it wasn't in the similar way. He just was sending private messages, which are not, as you know, you can't look at if you're a social network. Because they're private, and some of them, we don't know what one he was on. It was not encrypted, I believe. But in any case, that's how I tend to look at it, and I focus on the way our civil society has become uncivil, not in complete part, because I think the formula was already there, but due to the reliance on social media as the way we communicate with each other and the internet. And so it creates a breakdown in communities and creates anonymity and all kinds of stuff that's problematic.
Has the impact of social media on our society, do you think, more often than not and more than not, been sort of baleful? I mean, have we, as a direct result of social media, moved away from each other as a country and as a people and become more adversary and more extreme in views?
Well, I think we become reductive because it is it's by nature a viral medium. It's a reductive medium. You can't have cogent thoughts. This is not an argument in court or more long. It takes complexity and mashes it into partisanship, pretty much. Things are mostly complex. And if you look at polling, most people are for gun reform and all the things they talk about. And yet, because of the way things are structured and how people can, someone say like a Marjorie Taylor Greene can be so famous, but she wouldn't have been before, right? She would have just been some crazy person down from Georgia, essentially. As one of these representatives we've had from time to time. And one of the things that's hard is that on the whole, yes, it has been negative. On the plus side, it does during the pandemic, we were able to operate in ways we wouldn't have been operated before. But it does create, it's part of a larger trend, and it's not because of social media, but it also has, I say it's weaponized and amplified it. These were trends that were already happening, the breakdown of churches, schools, government institutions, but it goes hand in glove because people don't trust government because of the stuff they're reading online. And that happened before. It happened definitely before. It's just a question of how amplified it is now and how much malevolent players manipulate it in order to bring the breakdown even further.
You know, I'm struck by the fact you mentioned the course that I've taught and I've been teaching through the years, and from a democratic small d perspective, when all this began, it was celebrated unreservedly that this was democracy at work. More people, less money, more access, et cetera.
Yeah.
I mean, I sometimes ask myself, I mean, were we better off when there were 3 networks and Walter Cronkite told us what to think?
No, of course, because that was run by, I had a big argument when I was in school there, not with you, when they were talking about this trend towards, it was just the beginnings of the internet and still not around, but the idea of digital communications. And I had an argument with someone, I think it was the New York Times. I was like, well, there's like 10 guys on the Upper East Side of New York that decides things. Is that any better? No, and it's all the same guy, essentially. And so I think that there's one thing that happened, and like you look at something like Google. Like Google, you search and you get what you're looking for. There's not a lot of partisanship on Google. Like if you search for one thing, you get the thing you want. I think what's happened is a lot of this stuff on social media, particularly, including on Google's YouTube, it's owned by Alphabet, is the new name for the conglomeration of companies there, is that Google is governed by speed and context and accuracy. Essentially, you're looking for Floyd Abrams, you get information about Floyd Abrams, for example. When you get into social media, though, it is governed by virality and speed and engagement, and therefore what you get tends to be the louder things. And you don't necessarily, when you search Floyd Abrams, get Floyd Abrams. You get someone who doesn't like Floyd Abrams or whatever. And so it lends itself to anger. It lends itself to rage. It lends itself to reductiveness. And so I was never I was like, this could go bad. And I remember being at a Facebook meeting when they were showing live off to reporters, and I kept putting my hand up and saying, what about killings? What about murders? What about bullying? What about suicide? And they were sort of like, you're a bummer, Kara Swisher. And I'm like, yeah, I don't know. It just seems like any tool has been misused. Any technological tool gets taken in a negative way. Just the same. There's a very famous quote by Paul Virilio, which is, when you have the ship, you get the shipwreck. And when you have electricity, you get the electric chair. Doesn't mean there's something wrong with electricity. It means that humans have an ability to take tools like this and turn them into malevolent tools.
But are we more violent as a society? Are we more distant from each other because of the very closeness that is now available?
Yeah. I do think, I don't know about violent, because I remember when video games were supposed to make young men want to kill people, and it really wasn't. There was no correlation. There was a, like, this is not so great for young men kind of thing, but there was no correlation. In this case, you can just see, the election lie thing happening. I remember writing back in 2019, I wrote a piece where I said, what if Trump loses the election, then he says the election was stolen and was a lie, and then he asks his people to stop it from happening, like stop it from being approved. And at the time when I wrote it, I remember Twitter executives were like, Kara, that's an irresponsible thing to say. And I said, no, this is what could happen. Like, it makes sense. Why wouldn't he do this? And you're doing nothing to stop it. And because you've decided to be, you're the expert here on. They use free speech in the way that I don't think it was intended, and it's gotten a hold just the way people misread the Second Amendment. They misread the First Amendment, and they misread a lot of things, and keep thinking, say, for example, that Twitter, just recently, someone who's trying to buy Twitter, Elon Musk, keeps calling it the public square. And I'm like, it's a private company. I don't know, maybe it's like a public square, but it's not that kind of thing. And so there's all these people making decisions for a broader society, a very powerful and rich people. And that's the problem, is that there's no good decisions to be made. That, it's hard. I don't know how I would make a decision, honestly, if I had to be making over millions of people what they see.
I mean, has it had a worse impact in this country than abroad? I mean, is it something about
abroad,
us?
It's terrible. Well, around guns, yes, because we're gun-addled in this country, right? That's a different thing. That's gone on for a long, long time, and helped by the NRA and everything else. We've been gun-addled forever, like forever. That's not an issue. It just gets amplified. In other countries, yes, there's all kinds of problems around elections, whether it's the Philippines, Myanmar, it goes on and on and on. And right now in the Ukraine, that's what the Russians had done for years, trying to soften up Ukraine, or using digital tools, screwing up their electric grids, putting all kinds of misinformation in that country. Didn't work in this case. The Ukrainians turn out to be pretty good at online propaganda on the other side. And so, yes, in other countries, that's really where the real problems are, is places that say use Facebook as the news organization there. That's where we have at least more choices. But
in those countries, are they able to, in effect, censor Facebook sufficiently so that only the government side gets out?
Yes. Oh, yeah. It's happening in India. You know what I mean? Like, they're very different fights going on there. But, in the Philippines is a perfect example. Maria Ressa, who I've interviewed several times, she's been attacked relentlessly with false stories by the government, using all kinds of means, not just direct means, because that's that's harder. They use all these direct minions to do this, and so all of it false. And she's the one who came to me in 2016 and said, "Carol, look at this." And she went to Facebook and they ignored her. Like, this is dangerous. What's happening here? This is whole scale dictators love Facebook. Dictators love that kind of stuff because they can use it, or not Facebook in particular, it just happens to be the biggest. But they love this stuff if they can manipulate it.
I mean, imagine Hitler with Facebook.
Right. He didn't need it. He didn't need it.
True
Let's
enough.
just be clear. I do say that. I'm like, Mussolini did not need Instagram to be.
Yeah, and one really.
But imagine.
Go on. Yeah.
He could. Just the idea of it. Years ago, when Google was trying to control all of search, essentially, and they were trying to buy Yahoo, or at least run Yahoo search, that would have given them a 90-some% of the market. And as a lawyer, you understand what that means. And I remember writing, at least Microsoft knew they were thugs when they were trying something similar around software. And one of the Google founders called me up and he said, "We're not thugs, we're nice guys." And I said, "I'm not worried about you. I'm worried about who would own Google next."
Yeah.
And I was like, "What if Hitler owned Google?" Like, interesting. Like, and they're like, "Hitler's not going to, he's dead." I'm like, "That's not the point." Like, I was like, "You're nice, but I don't know who." Yeah. The amount of information these companies have on you, we rely on the kindness of strangers, really, and powerful, rich, billionaire strangers. So that's a problem for me.
Talk to me about content modification and moderation, of course.
They would like to modify it for sure.
What's your own sense about where you would like social media to be? What you think would best, let's exalt this a bit, best serve the public?
They're private money-making businesses, so I don't know if that's, I don't think people who make one, like bread, think, well, how can I best serve the public, or who make Kleenex or whatever. It's they like to put themselves on a different plane, but they do have a different power. It's just like the broadcast networks did, and there was so much litigation around that, and fairness, and this and that. But there's been there's been no regulation on these companies, none, zero. And the regulation that exists tends to protect them. Which is Section 230. So that's one thing. It's astonishing, the most powerful industry in the world right now doesn't have much regulation. There's a lot from Europe now suddenly, and over the years, and other countries, but not in this country. We still have a very hard time passing even basic privacy protections. But content moderation is incredibly difficult, and you have to make hard decisions, and you make a lot of mistakes. And one thing they've tried to do, I just surfaced an interview I did with Mark Zuckerberg over the Sandy Hook shootings. As you remember, Alex Jones tried to sell vitamins. He essentially tortured these dead children. And the parents, and they tried to get things down, and the only way they could actually get things down legally was through copyright, because they tended to use the pictures of the kids, and then the companies responded to copyright violations, but not to this is wrong, we're being harassed, et cetera, et cetera. And so I had a back and forth with him in November or October of 2000. I think it was 18, where I said, he's like, well, we want to have voices at the same, we want to protect as many voices as possible. I was like, even the malevolent voices, just make an editorial decision and say, this doesn't, we don't want to serve this in our restaurant. And he said, no, we want to protect as much voices no matter what. And I said, why can't you just take it? Just make an editorial decision and take it down. Say, this guy, I don't want him on my platform. He's malevolent. And he was very loath to do that. And one of the parents, Lenny Posner, who I also interviewed, his son was the youngest person killed at Sandy Hook, spent years trying to get this stuff down, and really ultimately concluded that they were only interested in growth and power, and they didn't want to make these hard decisions. And so content moderation is almost impossible to make, whether it's algorithmic, whether it's people. You can't have enough people to do this. And then you have people making decisions, and therefore who's making the decision. They've got to just say, we're just going to, this is not the social network we want, and we're going to suffer the slings and arrows of people who say we're censoring them, when in fact we're a private company. And they don't want to do that for the most part. They haven't wanted to do that.
But don't they do it with respect to racist comments and certain other comments? So they know how to do it, right?
Certainly, it's random and haphazard. That's the problem. And any they have rules, but any law applied haphazardly, it's like if nobody stops you from going a stop sign, you go through the stop sign, right? Don't you? I do. If there's a photo thing saying 25 miles per hour and then you get a ticket, you're like, I think I'm going to go slow. And so I think that's one of the problems, is that there's no. It's so haphazard and changes. And let me just say, on behalf of these companies, it's difficult. The calls they have to make are difficult. But this is as they say in The Godfather, this is the business they're in. So they should understand the business that they're in.
Let's go back to one of the most noteworthy examples of one of these companies stepping in, taking a stand, and that is Trump. And the lifetime ban, et cetera. How do you view all that in retrospect, and maybe even for the future?
Yeah, it's interesting. They had let him get away with all kinds of stuff for the longest time. That's the thing. They let him get, again, haphazard and random, and they let him, in plain sight. Like you said, he could walk down Fifth Avenue and shoot someone in plain sight. And so he did that, and then they finally, on January 6th, didn't want to be, what I say, handmaidens to sedition, and they pulled him down. Then they suddenly pulled him down, and it was the right call. But first of all, only 2 people made it. They pulled him down, but they didn't pull other people down, and they didn't what I mean? Like it was so haphazard. But sure, everybody's happy about it. He did violate their rules. Caused all untold problems, and then Twitter makes it a permanent ban, which is very hard if he was the president again. Facebook does one that's a little less severe, but says wouldn't give numbers, like we're going to keep you in jail I don't know how long, which nobody could do in real life, right? Like just whenever we want, right. And then we'll let you know. And which is almost worse. I was sort of like, give a number or something. So right now they're sort of if Elon Musk buys it, he said he can come back on. Others at Facebook are trying to figure out what to do, and they tried to push it over to the Facebook board. And now it's a 2-year suspension. What I would have done is said, you violated the rules in a really significant way. You already were, by the way. So many strikes. But here's the deal. We're going to let you on after 10 years. Right. That would have been brilliant, right? Oh, you can come back on, but maybe we'll reevaluate it in 5. But that would have been genius, because he'd be old, maybe dead, like, you know what I mean? Like that kind of thing. And so he wouldn't be relevant in 10 years.
Well, haven't they promised now to do something like that?
No. No, they've said 2 years, which is after certain
right.
elections. They should have done a 5-year thing. Just that would have been like very different. Right after the next presidential election is when they should have done it, and they should have stuck to it. And one of the things that was interesting, I was talking to someone from Facebook relatively recently, and they were like, "Oh, what are we going to do? Bring him back?" And I said, "You know what? You've already taken the attacks for throwing them off. You bring them back on, oy, oy, oy. You know what I mean? Like it's going to be over again. Just keep them off. Just keep them off, and then say 5 years or whatever years, however many years. But they weren't very creative. They acted in the moment, and that was one of the problems.
What do you think about their Supreme Court?
Well, it's supposed to be separate. It is. I think it's like I said, it was the UN, but less effective, which is like I was insulting them. I think it's hard. It's too many people. They had too many people. They were trying very hard. It was a very earnest effort. It has been, and the people on it have worked very hard. I just think they get recommendations back. They don't have to follow some recommendations. The decisions they have to follow. What I liked was when the oversight board, when they tried to get the oversight board to make the Trump decision, and the oversight board said it's your problem. Like they handed the oversight board essentially a sack of shit, and the oversight board said all yours and handed it right back. And so it is the responsibility of Facebook to take on the big decisions or Meta. And then if there's problems, to go to the oversight board. So, I don't know if there's any solution here. I kind of like the solution, but in practice, it's kind of hard. It's hard. It's overwhelming, I think.
Speaking of Twitter, speaking of Elon Musk, what's going to happen?
I don't know. What do you think? He's speaking of crazy. No, he's not crazy. I think he's going to get it. I think he's going to get it.
At a lower price, you think?
Yes, I think he's going to get it at a lower price. I don't think Twitter has a lot of options, unfortunately, for it. It's been running its business badly for years. It left itself open. It's a very attractive property to him, and he just wants it. He's the world's richest man, and he has the means to do it. He's putting his own money at great risk for something. I'm not really sure why he needs to own this particular car, but he does. And it's none of my business that he wants to own it, but I think he'll probably get it if he wants it, and I think he'll get it at a lower price. He could leave, but I think he's got the money to buy it, and he's got I don't know what leverage they have. You always have to have leverage, and I don't think they have any.
You mentioned Section 230 earlier, which for our audience, I should say, basically is a bomb to BALM, bomb to social media and the like, initially at least for the purpose of fostering a vibrant social media entities.
Sure.
I was struck by the fact that the last two presidential candidates both denounced Section 230, and yet no one is even trying to do anything.
Trump did have an executive order to look at it and this and that. They just can't do. You know what I mean? Removing it is ridiculous. Like you cannot do that. This would create, it might be a full employment act for lawyers, but it really is. Talk about, you think it's confusing now. Without it, it's going to be very confusing, and it also protects media companies, FYI. And so, I think one of the problems is that there's got to be exceptions, but then you got to be very careful around exceptions of who can be sued. I think the lack of ability to sue any company is always a problem, right? Lawyers serve that function. Legal cases serve that function of a check in this society. And so there has to be some way to make changes to it without eliminating it, because, again, without it, it's really... Even the biggest companies are in jeopardy, I think, from what I understand. And I think a lot of people I think you get a presidential candidate, whether it's Biden or Trump, saying, Section 230, and then they don't know what they're talking about. I mean, honestly, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't even know what I'm talking about, but I know a little bit more than they do. And I know that it's a complex situation to pick it apart.
And if you've got... How many subscribers, so to speak, does Facebook have now around the world?
I don't know, billions.
The last number I knew was 2 billion, and maybe it's more. I mean, the idea of putting on them the burden of following each conversation between you and me.
Exactly.
If you and I are talking and we defame somebody. I mean, there's a privacy you mentioned earlier. There's a privacy
Yep.
side to this also.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And then that's a whole nother thing, whether it's encryption or whatever. There's 2.9 billion people on just Facebook, and that's not Instagram. I don't think it includes Instagram. And in some countries, it's 99% of the use. Some number that's crazy. But everybody uses it. Billions. I mean, it's a huge amount of people. Instagram, WhatsApp. When you add them all up, it's just it's a legal nightmare. That would hinder these. That would really hurt these companies.
Oh yeah,
really,
yeah.
All of them. Well, Instagram is 1.2 billion users, which is a lot. And then WhatsApp. I'm looking them up right now on the internet. Thank you, Google. So I think people have to tread carefully. There's some very 2 billion for WhatsApp. You have to really tread carefully. There's some very thoughtful legislators thinking about this, but. You may be able to be protected if you're a certain size or not a certain size and stuff like that. But it certainly will hurt small companies because they won't be able to legally sustain themselves.
Yeah. Let's go back to class again. You and I, I taught, you listened, you learned.
I did.
What do you think of the United States Supreme Court? What is your reaction?
I'm not an expert.
I speak to you as one citizen to another.
I think it should be bigger. I just think it should be bigger. There should be more of them. I think there probably should be they have to retire after a certain amount of time. There might be a way that it could be, the political stuff has gotten so ridiculous around it. There might be a new way to select them that's more bipartisan. But although I don't see that happening, they shouldn't lie when they're being questioned. They should at least tell the truth. About what their intentions are. I think I think any appointment for life is a problem. I really do. I don't get that. And then
even podcast hosts.
Even podcasts. Oh yeah, I'm a podcaster for life. I get thrown out when I'm done, like when the advertisers don't want to pay anymore. But I don't know. I think probably term limits is something. I think about being larger is something. I know it's controversial, and I understand why it is, but term limit seems to be the thing I think is important. I think after a certain time, everybody has to retire. So why shouldn't they? Let
me ask a more deliberately frivolous question. Are you following the Johnny Depp trial?
I'm not. I'm the only person in America who isn't. I feel bad for all of them. They're all, at some point in this really ugly world, I don't really relish in other people's weirdness. I just don't. It's sad. It's sad and pathetic. And I don't, I get why people like it, but I don't. I think it's kind of sad. I think the whole thing is sad. I'd rather watch Top Gun 2, which I did, which is amazing, by the way. I just would rather do that. If I want to be entertained by something, I'd rather be interested in something that's fun.
What do you think of the whole notion of televising trials?
I don't think we can go back. Right?
No, I don't think we can go back,
I
don't think we should. But I'm interested in your view.
I think we should televise trials. Yeah, I think we should televise trials. I think we should. I know judges then act to the trial, right? That's the problem, or the prosecutors do. Everybody performs for the audience. I don't know. I think probably I always like more transparency, so it's fine. I would rather have it just be, there's nothing. The entertainmentization of law has been going on for a long time, as you know, with these ridiculous shows. Even back to when I was a kid, when not Judge Judy, but it was People's Court or whatever. That it's inevitable. And by the way, a lot of entertainment is either a medical show or a legal show. So I'm a big fan of Law and Order, including yours.
No, but
I watched Law and Order since
I think the public does learn a lot.
They do
about the legal system, even if it
in a broad way.
Oh yes, only in a broad way, and this.
It's like medical. My brother's a doctor, and he's always like, "That's not how you do it." And I'm like, I feel like they're going for drama here and not accuracy. It's I said, "Is it relatively accurate?" He goes, "It's relatively accurate." And of course, he gets offended. Like, that's not how you do a shot. That's not how you do this. I was like, I don't think people care.
A final biographical question: when did you start yourself being online? When did you start doing podcasts? Tell us.
I'm very interested in change. I constantly am changing my career, constantly, or doing different things within the same confines of journalism. And so I was a reporter at the Washington Post on my way up to the top of covering politics. That was like the White House, this and that. And I thought, oh, I don't want to do that. I really did. I was like, this weird culture in Washington of insularity was really problematic for me. And so I started covering a small company in 1992, 3, called America Online, and I met Al Gore, who was working on commercializing the internet. He did kind of invent the internet, even though he said it wrong, but he kind of did. He was important to that. And so I started to get really interested, and I had studied at Columbia, where I was the journalism school, where I took your course, actually. Propaganda was my big area of expertise, and I was fascinated with the uses of propaganda. And when I saw the internet, I'm like, oh, this is a worldwide propaganda network. And so I got very interested in it because the idea of a worldwide communications network was really fascinating to me. And so I started covering AOL and then the other companies in the early 90s. And that's where, and I never stopped. I thought it was fascinating. And so very few people did, because everyone was still focused on broadcast networks and newspapers. And I was at the Washington Post, and I said to Don Graham, this business is finished. Just so you know, classifieds will be over, advertising will be over, subscriptions are challenged, although they could come back, but boy, you got to change your business really fast. And he laughed, like he's a lovely guy. And so I really got interested in the business parts of it and also the societal implications. And I kept covering it. I went to the Wall Street Journal. Then I did my own thing within the Wall Street Journal. Then I broke away from the Wall Street Journal. So I became an entrepreneur in a lot of ways. And then sold it again, and then decided I want to do some stuff for the Times. And then I also do stuff for Vox. I'm sort of the modern equivalent of what a lot of journalists have been doing now with Substack and things like that. And then about 7-8 years ago, I started to really pay attention to podcasts because of the iPhone. I kept thinking the intimate relationship people have with their phones. And I had heard a couple of podcasts, and I was like, oh, this is where everything's going. And so I had a conference business also. And I thought, well, if I interview 16 people once a year, and I can go and interview hundreds of people, well, that's better. And I can, and people don't have to pay the amount of money to get into my expensive conference. And so I took one intern and myself, and I told the head of Vox, this guy, Jim Bankoff, who's wonderful. He always says yes to me. And I said, I'm going to stop running the website, and I'm going to do this. And most people would be like, you're fired. And he goes, okay. And it was the beginning of his podcast business, which was great. And I really like the pod. You like it.
I do. Isn't it fun? No, it's exactly fun. What it is. Yes.
It's substantive conversations around interesting topics, and people love it. And so I started doing it, and I love it. I still love it. I think it's a great business. It's a great business for me, at least. And I enjoy it. I think it's really a fascinating way to spend your days talking to people. And, cable is so reductive and ridiculous, and people yelling at each other, and you have 2 minutes to explain yourself, a complex topic. I don't like that. So I love it, and then we'll see next. I'm not into the metaverse yet, but we'll see. Maybe.
You're mentioning AOL reminds me that when it was just starting, they called and asked me to come down and give them advice on a legal issue. And I was wearing something like what I'm wearing now, a tie and a jacket.
Yeah, you do
and
look nice.
I showed up there, and they're all in dungarees.
Yes. Oh, dungaree. I haven't heard that word. I like the word dungaree. I've been wearing dungarees.
That's my 20th century word.
Yeah, exactly. It's a great word.
And they stared at me. I mean, as if this is a picture from the 19th century.
Yes, it's true. I enjoy your spats were particularly well taken. Your spats and top hat. Well. But, whatever. You wear whatever you want. Floyd, be who you are. Well, years ago, I was at a party. I'll tell you this last story. And it was a Hollywood party, and Robert De Niro was there. And so this guy, Barry Diller, called me over and said, I want you to meet Bob De Niro. And I was, do you know who he is? I'm like, of course I know who he is. Hello. And he said, he has a question for you. And he said, this was the beginning of Twitter, right? Sort of the early days. And he goes, do I need to be on Twitter? And I looked at him, and he goes, because I hate it. My kids say it. My agents say it. I said, look at me, Bob De Niro. I said, you don't fucking need to be on Twitter at all. I said, you're Robert De Niro. you don't need to be on Twitter. He goes, thank you. And I go, you're welcome. And that was my best advice I ever gave.
Kara, if I
Thank
may,
you,
for
Floyd.
first name, thank you so much
Yes.
for doing this.
Thank you, Floyd. I have to tell you, best legal course I ever took. Only legal course I ever took, but best legal course I ever took.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.